Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. My name is Michael Rouse. We have an amazing host tonight, an expert from our great partners at Nemours, Dr. Pubi, a top physician that we're going to feature tonight, who will be walking us through our cold and flu season. All of us as parents are kind of preparing ourselves. Some of our kids have already had that common cold or the flu already. And tonight's webinar is really dedicated to really tackling this firsthand with the expert advice that we get from the great people over at Nemours. So just to tell you a little bit about today's session, you can see us, but we cannot see you. You're on mute, but please use the Q&A box to ask any questions you might have tonight. Share your questions as they arise. We will do our best to address as many questions as time allows tonight. This presentation is being recorded and will be emailed to enrolled families after tonight's event. So with that said, I want to take a moment just to introduce you to our wonderful expert, Dr. Pubi. And I want to just talk to you for a moment about the wonderful people at Nemours Children's Health. We have been a partner of theirs for 2 years now. Firsthand, as a dad of 4 children, we had our youngest, Naomi, who spent several months at Nemours, and the incredible love and expertise that we received from the Nemours team several years ago was nothing but miraculous and amazing. The love, the care, the empathy, the professionalism, the positivity that all the team members at Nemours provides families of all ages is just exceptional. And with that said, you're going to meet one of the exceptional, incredible doctors there, Dr. Pubi. But Dr. Pubi has an amazing background. She's a general outpatient pediatrician at the Folk Road office. She loves working with people of all ages, from newborns all the way up to teenagers who are on their way to college or starting their careers. Our favorite part of the day is really when she gets time to spend with her patients and their families. And Dr. Pubi loves watching her patients grow and really progress physically and mentally throughout the years. She's passionate about the care we are able to provide and training a new generation of doctors to do the same. She's a mentor to many and one of the best. So welcome, Dr. Pubi.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. This is such an important topic, and I'm so excited to be able to talk to you guys a little bit more about it. Thank you again for having me. My hope is that tonight will be informative, helpful. I know this time of year can be really intimidating, scary as we brace ourselves for what's to come, or like Michael said, some of us are already experiencing it. And so hopefully this will get us prepped and we'll be able to answer some of your questions as well. So just a general kind of idea of what we're going to be talking about tonight. We're going to go through the when, the what, the how of cold and flu season. We're going to talk a little bit about the signs and symptoms. What kinds of things are we watching for? When do those signs and symptoms become severe enough that we need to be talking about seeing a doctor? How do we prevent ourselves from getting colds and flus to begin with? What do we do when we missed kind of that prevention piece and now we have to manage them? And how do we balance our mental and physical health going through kind of a long, tough season? And then at the very end, we'll talk a little bit about flu shots as well, and then get to your questions that you guys have brought up too. So let's start with the when. We talk a lot about this cold and flu season, but what does that mean? So when we talk about the season, we're usually starting right around now, right around September, going into October, and that season lasts us all the way through March and April. Now, this is just when we see the bulk of these colds and flus, and these kind of viruses coming in more frequently than we typically see other times of year. It doesn't mean that we don't get colds other times of year, that we don't still get sick. Unfortunately, we all hear about those summer colds, or sometimes kind of late in the spring, we're still experiencing these things. But this is when we're trying to brace ourselves because we know that we're going to see a lot of them back to back. And sometimes it's the same viruses, sometimes it's different ones. So just preparing ourselves for this big bulk of the season. What are we talking about when we say colds versus flus? What does that mean? So we talk a lot about things like viruses, and that's what colds and flus are. So there's something that oftentimes our body is really amazing and able to fight off ourselves, but some are more severe than others. And the reason that we often mention the flu is because we know it can make us feel really sick. And people often say, you look like you have the flu. And it just means you look like you just don't feel good. And we know that in the past, we've seen people who've gotten really sick from the flu more frequently than with some of the other cold viruses that we talk about. That's why it kind of gets its own special category. And when we talk about that, we really are talking about people who are ending up in the hospital, people who are needing some extra support that we couldn't manage at home. Those are the things that we talk about. But the flu is still a type of cold. And so it means that we manage them at home when we can, a lot of the same ways. And that's what we're going to get into in just a little bit. So how do these things go around? Why do we get them? Why do we get so many of them? Some of them are kind of those things we think about, right? Coughing and sneezing. And so you are sitting at the airport, you're sitting at school, you're sitting kind of anywhere at the grocery store, walking around, you hear someone cough next to you or sneeze next to you and you stop and you just hope, please tell me I'm not going to catch whatever they have. Because that's the most obvious way that these germs spread. Doesn't take a whole lot. But the other things that we don't always think about are something as simple as touching our face. Maybe we kind of just went to move our hair like I just did a few minutes ago, and then we went and touched something else. Maybe our kiddos have kind of touched their face, played with a toy, moved on to something else. We didn't even see it happen, but now someone else has come and touched the same toy. Sometimes we think about things like we've brought cookies to work, or there's a shared treat in the classroom, and maybe someone again touched their face, didn't even think about it, went and grabbed a cookie, and now someone else has grabbed another cookie. Those are all things that can spread these same germs and spread those colds and flus. Now, there are some other things I hear a lot. I grew up hearing them. I still hear them. So things like the worry, did I get sick because I went outside with wet hair? It was cold outside. I went outside and now I woke up sick the next day. Well, the good thing is enough people were worried about it that we actually looked into it. And thankfully, we have found that going outside with cold, wet hair, still okay. Not going to get us sick. The other one we think about a lot is it was snowing, it was cold, and I really wanted a popsicle outside, and I let them have it, and now they're sick. And I hear this in my office a whole lot. I've had families that come in and they're really worried that they let their kid get sick because of this. And the answer is they didn't. So even though eating a popsicle in the cold may not seem like the best idea at all times, if it's something we want to do, it's not something that should be getting us sick. Now, sometimes incorporating some healthy habits and healthy choices can help us prevent from getting sick or not get sick as long. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But it's not the actual process of doing those things outside in the cold that's making us get sick. It's those germs that we're talking about, those coughing, sneezing, touching, all those different things. That's how those germs are spreading. So what are we looking for? There's a whole bunch of things that we can see. Sometimes we see sneezing or coughing or congestion or runny nose. Sometimes we see all of those things. Sometimes we see just a couple of those things. And the reason I talk about those first is because those are tend to be the earliest signs we see. And now they sound pretty familiar because we can see them with allergies and we can see them with colds. So a lot of times, especially this time of year, our allergy season is also flaring up, and that makes things a little bit difficult. Do I have just a case of the sniffles? Do I just need some allergy medicine? Is this going to go away in a couple of days? Well, the answer is it really varies, and it's hard to tell from the first day or two. So the way I look at it is if you or your child is someone who every September, my allergies flare up, and every September I start with some sneezing and coughing and congestion, and then my doctor always tells me to go on this allergy medicine or wait out a couple weeks and then it goes away. That might be a good time to try that medicine that you've been prescribed in the past or talked about in the past. Doctors may have mentioned something like a Zyrtec or a Claritin for kids. That's a good option. Now, if your kid's someone that's never experienced any of those things in the past, and we've started with some sneezing and some runny nose, and now maybe their siblings starting with some sneezing and some runny nose, and maybe you're feeling a scratchy throat a little bit, that may be an early sign of a cold. And sometimes the answer is you really can't tell until things have progressed a little bit more. If you're ever not sure, it's a good time to see the doctor too. We're going to go back to the other side for just a second. We're going to talk a little bit more about it. Because this little section is so kind of variable across the board. So the other things that we sometimes see, or sometimes we see things like fatigue. Maybe we're just not acting like ourselves. Maybe your kiddo is someone who loves to run around and play as much as they possibly can, and you normally can't keep up. And all of a sudden, they're kind of sitting around a lot more. They're wanting to cuddle. They're not really wanting to get up as much, or you're noticing they're just not as playful as they normally are. Another thing that we think about is fevers. So you may notice that your child feels really hot or warm. And when we look about checking those temperatures, we're looking for a number of 100.4. That's what we consider a true fever. The thing about fevers is sometimes those numbers can get really high. We see 101, 102, even up to 104, and it can feel really scary to see a number that high when you're checking your child's temperature. The thing about fevers is that they're actually our body's way of doing exactly what our bodies are supposed to be doing. They're helping us fight off whatever we're fighting. So whatever virus is going on that we're fighting, our body's doing its job. However, when we have a fever, we often do not feel very good. We often feel really tired. We may feel really just sick. We may not want to eat or drink very much. And those things can become dangerous if we're not seeing that we're drinking enough. And so we talk about decreased appetite. And sometimes that means we just don't want to eat, but we're still sipping on things. And sometimes that means we don't want to eat or drink anything. Those are the things that we're watching out for. You might have a sore throat. Sometimes it's scratchy, sometimes it's painful. And kids may be a little bit fussier compared to baseline. You just notice they're grumpy. This is not who they are. This is not them. For our younger kiddos, the other thing that I want you to watch for is those diapers. So if this kid normally makes 7 diapers a day and they're only making 4, that's something that I want you to think about, kind of noticing early signs and symptoms of colds and flus. If they're having headaches or muscle aches or body aches, those are all other things that we can often see. So all in all, to say the signs and symptoms of colds and flus can range from just a couple sneezes all the way to feeling like you have a fever, body aches, sore throat, and the whole gambit. So a little bit across the board. So when do we go to the doctor? And my number one thing is anytime you're worried, call your pediatrician. You know your kids best, so trust your gut, because I trust your gut. So if you're coming into my office and you said, I don't know, it's probably nothing, but I'm worried something seems off, I love that. I think that's so important. I would always rather check them out and find out things are actually okay. Make sure they're not dehydrated, make sure there's no signs of anything else going on, than you be worrying at home knowing that you think something's off and we didn't look. Let's check, let's make sure. Other things that I want to think about are fevers we talked about are totally safe. They're not going to injure our children. But if those fevers are starting to last longer than 3-4 days and you don't notice that your kiddo's improving at all, that's a good time to bring them in too. The reason being is I really just want to make sure there's not anything else going on that's causing those fevers. The other things that we're looking for are signs of dehydration. And so we talked a little bit about watching those diapers. Any kiddo that's having less than 3 diapers a day or just kind of barely making the 3rd diaper a day, those are kids I'm going to want to see in my office. In our older kids, we're talking about kind of, you might notice they're barely taking a sip of anything today. They really don't want anything. Those are all signs that we're looking for. You might look at their tongue and say, looks a little dry to me. Should I go bring them in? The answer is always call us. We are happy to talk about it. We're always happy to walk through it on the phone too. And, if we decide together that we need to see your kiddo or that you think your kiddo should be seen, we're going to bring them in and take a good look. The other thing that we look for is symptoms lasting longer than expected. And this one's hard because viruses can drag, and some of them are only lasting a few days, 3 or 4 days. Sometimes they're lasting a whole lot longer. They can last up to a week, 2 weeks, which is really hard. So how do you know if it's lasting longer than expected? My rule of thumb is kind of if we're hitting the week mark and we're not feeling any improvement, I think it's a good time to come in. Let's make sure there's not anything new going on. I want to make sure that there's no signs of pneumonia when I listen to their lungs. I want to make sure that there's no ear infections because we often see those pop up after a virus. I want to make sure that they're overall looking like they're staying hydrated. Again, when we're hitting that week mark, that's around the time. The other thing is if they're starting to get better, you're like, all right, I think we're on the mend. We're kind of hitting that week mark. Maybe we're still coughing, but we don't have a fever anymore. We're drinking a little bit better. That's great. That's a good sign. Maybe we're kind of fixing ourselves. Great. But if we're kind of getting to 2 weeks and we're still sort of having all those same symptoms and they haven't fully gone away, I still want to see them. I want to bring them in. The other thing that I want to talk about is some of our kiddos who have things like asthma. So kind of going into what we were just talking about a little bit more is when you need to bring your kid in. For kiddos with asthma, this may be a little bit sooner. So you may find that your kiddo doesn't typically need their albuterol or their medication. However, you're finding that in the last couple of days, they've been using that albuterol much more frequently, maybe every 4 hours, maybe 3, 4 times a day. These are things that I want to see them for because I don't want them getting worse before we see them. We want to really prevent those flares from getting any worse and keeping them out of the hospital. Okay. Um, so rule of thumb in terms of when to see the doctor are going to be big things like when you feel like you're worried about your kid and things aren't getting better, watching the time frame, watching for signs of dehydration, and then making sure that overall you're able to feel like you can manage it at home. Because if you're ever not sure, I'd rather see them. So
Sorry,
what can we do? Oh yeah, go ahead, Michael.
sorry about that. So one of the things we have as a family have been told that some sprays at times can also be good for kids who are going through, allergies or cold season. What are your thoughts about that?
So sprays in general, like nose sprays, is that what you're thinking of?
Those sprays, yeah.
Yeah, so we're gonna talk about management in a little bit, but in terms of nose sprays, I think it varies. So if you have allergies, nose sprays can definitely be more helpful than some of the oral medicines or helpful with the oral medicines. In terms of kind of just general illness, I think of more like a saline spray, which has just basically like water in it. And I think that can be helpful. I will say for some kids, the feeling of putting something in your nose when you're sick is so much worse than just not putting something in your nose. And when it becomes kind of a horrible sensation to do that, we're already not feeling well, then I'm not sure the benefit outweighs the risk. And then we'll talk a little bit too, but sometimes kind of finding an alternative. So for our younger kids too, I have a lot of them who just, there's no way we're not putting anything in my nose. And so we may kind of steam up the whole bathroom and sit in there and let that sort of do its job too. So sometimes that can be a good option.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about prevention. How do we stop ourselves from getting sick? So the number one thing I'm going to tell you is hand washing. Hand washing, hand washing, hand washing. And the reason I say this is because this is the best way to prevent any spread of germs. And I think this is a really important time to talk about it because we're just getting into that season. And so, especially for our younger kiddos, but even for ourselves, for our teenagers, getting into a habit and a routine can make a huge difference. So, when should we be washing our hands? We know we're supposed to wash them, but my rule of thumb is kind of every time we're coming in from any activity. So, whether we're at the grocery store, we stopped at Target to grab something, we were out playing soccer or another sport, first thing we do when we come home, wash our hands. And this can be soap and water, this can be sanitizer, that's fine, either one. The one thing is I recommend a little bit more soap and water just because as we're doing this so frequently, sometimes sanitizer can dry out our hands a little bit more and we don't want that either. The other time that we always want to be practicing washing our hands is before we eat anything. So breakfast, lunch, dinner, snack, if we can get into the habit of we washed our hands and then we ate, this is the best thing we can do to help prevent germ spreading. So we talked earlier about didn't even notice, I touched my face, I touched something else, you touched that thing, and now you used your hands to grab a piece of fruit or, a snack. And that is all it took for those germs to spread. So getting your kids in the habit of doing this at home, especially now, the later into the season we're going to get, the less likely they are to bring some of those things home. Sometimes at school, right, this can be challenging depending on their age. They may or may not have the option to like run to the bathroom when they're at lunch, wash their hands, and then start eating. So another thing that we could think about, especially kids who are taking lunch from home and who have a lunchbox that they use, some of those little clip-on sanitizers can be perfect. A good way to remind them, okay, we're going to sanitize and then start eating. That can be a really, really helpful thing. The other things when we think about prevention, how do we prevent the spread? Avoiding big groups or group activities once we know we're sick. So we'll get into a little bit more, but if you have a little bit of sniffles, a little bit of congestion, you're not sure, it's okay, I understand. Once you know your kid's not acting like themselves, they might have a fever, they're coughing everywhere, it's probably a good time to kind of keep them out of some of those bigger activities, those fun play dates that we might have planned, sports activities, and encouraging our friends to do the same. So everything goes both ways. If we're kind of staying home, we're avoiding going to those activities. It feels bad for us, but we're protecting a lot of other people, and we hope that other people are doing the same for us. So if they're doing the same thing, they're not coming to those activities as they're starting to show symptoms, we're getting that same level of protection. So I think that's really, really important, is reminding everybody that this is something we're all in together, us preventing you from getting sick, you preventing us from getting sick. It's all teamwork, okay? And then the next thing that we're going to talk about in terms of prevention is flu shots and staying up to date on vaccines. So we're going to talk about flu shots a little bit at the end, but the other vaccines that your kiddo gets just during childhood, just checking in, making sure they're up to date. And the couple of these that I'm really referring to are the pneumonia vaccine, because we do see a lot of pneumonias this time of year that follow some of these colds and flus. And then the other thing that we're seeing a lot of right now is pertussis, which is whooping cough. And I wish we weren't seeing so much of it, but we are seeing a lot of kids come in with really horrible coughs, because this is something that spreads very easily, and that's built into your tetanus shot. So just a couple things to check in with your pediatrician about. We talked a little bit about our kiddos with asthma earlier, but again, in terms of prevention, if your kiddo is someone who you really haven't had to use your inhaler in a long time, wonderful. If your kiddo is someone that you noticed lately, they've been waking up at night coughing, they're really not sick. You noticed on the playground, maybe they're getting a little more short of breath, they're having some trouble wheezing more frequently than they normally do. Talk to your pediatrician, because one of the things we want to do is make sure that their asthma is under really good control as we're getting into cold and flu season. And then let's talk a little bit about natural immunity. So when we talk about prevention, what other things can we do to help prevent these things from coming home to us, or from us being the ones that get sick? So good, healthy meals. And this is so much easier said than done, I know, but incorporating those fruits and veggies into our regular meals can make a huge difference. We know that kiddos' bodies are pretty magical, and they are able to absorb all these wonderful nutrients. And so giving them those options is a really good thing. Now, not all of our kiddos are going to want to eat fruits and veggies. They just aren't. That's the reality. So finding cool ways to sneak them in can be really great too. So if your kiddo is someone who just loves pasta, that's what you're going to get in them, that's fine. That's great. But maybe if they like spaghetti sauce, we can blend that sauce with some peppers or some spinach, because you can't really taste it in the sauce. It hides itself. But all of a sudden, we're getting some servings of vegetables in there. If they love popsicles, let's freeze some Greek yogurt mixed with berries. Great. Popsicles. Awesome. But all of a sudden, we're getting a couple servings in there. They don't need to eat servings all day long, but at least as often as we can get them in, especially this time of year, the better they're going to do. I get a lot of questions about, the need for any like additional supplements. A lot of vitamin C supplements come up at this time of year. And the good thing is that kids are so good at absorbing their nutrients from their daily intake. So those fruits and veggies we're talking about, but even from other foods, that we don't really recommend supplements on top of that for our generally healthy kiddos. And the reason is because the studies have shown that it doesn't necessarily make as big a difference as having those natural healthy meals. So things like citrus fruits, kiwi, actually Brussels and spinach have really good resources for vitamin C. And then even vitamin D is pretty important for our immune protection. So when we think about milk, yogurt, cheese, these are all really great foods that kind of help our bodies preventing these illnesses, or if we're getting sick, they're helping us keep ourselves from getting as sick as someone else, or lasting as long as it would if we weren't being healthy otherwise. So those are big things that we want to think about. What do we do if we get sick? What are we going to do? So the number one thing is what we call, you'll hear the word supportive care a lot. Well, what does that mean? It means that we're really supporting you and your kiddo the best we can, make them feel their best, even though this virus is kind of hard to deal with. And so some of the ways that we do that are, sometimes we need medicines like Tylenol or ibuprofen. Tylenol's okay, even in some of our younger kiddos, but ibuprofen shouldn't be used in anyone less than 6 months, so that's important to know. And my goal with this is, a lot of people worry, and we talked earlier about that fever. So they have a fever, so I gave them Tylenol. That's totally fine. What I want us to make sure we're thinking about is that we're looking at your kiddo themselves. So if your kiddo has no fever, but they're miserable, they don't want to drink, they don't want to eat, they feel really warm, or they just don't seem themselves, it's okay to try a dose of one of these and see if that helps them drink a little bit more, maybe gets them a little bit more energy. If your kiddo's sleeping and they have 101 temperature, I'm okay with you not waking them up to give them the medicine. Let them sleep, let their body do their healing. this is kind of what we mean when we say look at your kiddo instead of that temperature. If you're ever not sure, call your office, make sure, check in, and make sure that you have the kind of dosing, because in kids, a lot of that dosing is weight-based. So make sure you have those up-to-date dosing so you're ready for the season. The other thing that we really want to do is focus on hydration. So sometimes when we're sick, we don't want to eat as much. That's totally okay. We know that kids can bounce back really fast after they get sick, and they'll kind of build their appetite right back up and make up for all those days that they didn't eat as much. But what we do want to make sure is that they're drinking enough. When we're sick, our body's actually using more energy, and it's using more energy to kind of fight off those viruses that we're seeing, but it also means we can get dehydrated a little bit quicker. So it can be water, it can be juice. We could do Pedialyte, or Pedialyte popsicles are a really great option. Soup broth, anything that they want to drink, I'm fine with, as long as they're drinking. With drinking, they may not want to drink a whole cup or an 8-ounce bottle of something right away. They may want to do small sips more frequently. So what I say is try and remind them, like every 15, 20 minutes, if you guys are sitting, kind of cuddling or just taking it easy, couple sips, because those sips add up. And I'm okay if that's kind of how we have to do things, as long as we're getting a little bit of those hydration pieces taken care of. Another thing that can be really helpful is a spoon of honey. So no one less than 12 months can have honey, unfortunately. But a lot of the medicines that we think about, like the Zarbee's, is a very common one, is mostly honey-based. And so a spoon of honey, if you guys have honey at home, is a great option. And we've actually done studies to compare, how does cough syrup measure up to honey? They're the same. So even now, I take a spoon of honey when I'm not feeling well. I think it's a great idea. It works really well, and you can do it as often as every few hours. Some kids don't love the taste of honey, so if you want to do a little honey in warm water, or some people like to add a little bit of lemon into it to change the taste, those are great ways to do that as well. Any of those are a good option, again, for anyone 12 months and up. Another thing, we were kind of just talking, Michael and I were just talking about this a few minutes ago, in terms of how else can we help. Steam is a great option, especially when we're feeling really congested, or for our kiddos who are younger have really runny noses. Steam up the bathroom. They don't have to sit in the tub or be in the shower. Just turn the shower on for like 10 minutes, get the bathroom really hot, and then go sit in there for about 10, 15 minutes, or as long as it feels good. And that's going to help everything drain. I often recommend this kind of right before bed, because a lot of times that's around the time that things are really feeling plugged up, and then we're going to go lay down and everything's dripping in the back of our throat. It feels horrible. So this is a really good time to do that. But you can do this as often as it feels good. So if this is your 9-month-old and steamy bathrooms are making them feel good, great, let's do it every couple hours. That's awesome. We were talking about sprays, so saline spray or saline drops. Saline sprays for some of our older kids can kind of help flush things out if it feels good. Even for our younger kids, sprays or the drops are totally fine. And then using a suction. Some people have like the blue suction from the nursery. Some people have the nose Frida. There's a bunch of different options out there. Any of them are great, just to help kind of suction out the kiddo's nose, especially when they're younger. Now, the only thing with this is we don't want to be digging out things all the time. So sometimes we hear it, we're like, they look okay, but I hear something, I want to get it. I don't always recommend it, because the suction does make their nose a little bit raw if we're doing it too often. So what I suggest is doing it kind of as needed. So if you're noticing that your kiddo's really not wanting to feed because they're really congested, go ahead and try sucking their nose. The other thing that we're watching for is if their breathing looks like it's getting a little bit harder, or in our younger kiddos, we're seeing something called belly breathing, where their belly's going in and out and in and out more than normal. Those are things that I'm watching for, when we talked a little bit about that earlier too, but bringing them into the doctor to be seen. But the first thing I'm going to do is have you try and suction them at home. Okay. The other thing that sometimes feels good is cool washcloths. So sometimes, even though I just kind of not feeling well, we're feeling warm, sometimes we have like what make people come in and say, like, I feel just sweaty all the time. So trying a cold washcloth either on the forehead or the back of the neck is definitely a good option. And then for our older kiddos who are sleeping with, usually like one pillow at night, adding an extra pillow at night to kind of help prevent post-nasal drip can be a really good option as well. Prevent some of the coughing overnight. So some combination of all of these things can definitely be helpful. Sometimes you're going to find that one kiddo responds a little bit better to one thing and your other kiddo responds better to another. We're going to go off of what feels best for them, because our goal is that they're drinking and that we're kind of able to get them through those few days or up to a week of that illness. That's what we're trying to do.
Doctor, for families that have multiple kids, usually, when a cold goes through our house or the flu, that first child is getting a ton of attention. Um, by the fourth, you want to be like an F1 pit crew and you want that child out as fast as possible. Like, what is the right way to do this when it comes to when is a child contagious? When can they go back to school or childcare or camp? Because obviously you don't want to get others sick, but after going through the household, it can become pretty draining and tiring for parents. What do
Yeah.
you recommend?
That's such a good question, and it's something that is you're right, it's so hard. How are you supposed to find the balance? So the biggest thing is we say you can technically go back when you have no fever for 24 hours. So we talked about that 100.4 temperature. And then I like to say if your symptoms are improving. So you don't have to be 100%. But my goal is that you're at least feeling a little bit better than you were when your illness was at its worst. So if you feel the exact same, we may want to take another day or two. But if you're like, yesterday I felt a lot worse. Today I feel I have a little more energy, or maybe my congestion's not as bad, or their cough sounds a little bit better today, it's okay to start sending them back. And I always say, grain of salt. Sometimes you try and send them back and then they call 3 hours later and they look worse. And you said, sorry, I didn't realize they really looked better. And that happens. But we're doing our best here. And that's where we sort of say that's our balance. That's kind of our idea. And then we know that we may have to make those adjustments once they go back.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So let's talk, and guys, this is perfect transition. So let's talk about balance. How do we balance kind of keeping that exposure, spreading those germs, and also not missing out? We talked earlier, cold and flu seasons lasting now through March and April. That's a long time, especially for kids who are maybe, younger siblings in the house who are seeing some of these things for the first time. They don't have any of that strong immunity. Kids who are in preschool or kindergarten for the first time or daycare for the first time, they're getting a lot of these illnesses back to back to back. So how are we going to manage them? What do we do best? How do we find that balance of keeping their morale up and also making their bodies healthy? So we're going to kind of talk, we talked a little bit just now, school, fever-free for 24 hours, symptoms somewhat improving. A lot of people, have gotten more comfortable over the years, fortunately or fortunately, wearing masks. So sometimes one of the things is if a kid's really eager to get back to school, but maybe you notice they're still coughing a ton, that's another option, is sending them back with a mask just to prevent those cold symptoms like we talked about, germs from spreading. One of the other things that I talk about is we talked earlier about those first few symptoms when we sort of have some cold, some sniffles, little congestion, but not really anything else. I think that's a really good time to kind of keep pushing ourselves a little bit, kind of keep our normal routine, add in those extra healthy foods, really focus on those vitamin C heavy rich foods, like the citrus fruits that we talked about, and still kind of able to go to our regular day-to-day activities. And that will hopefully help kind of keep some of our morale up. Once we start seeing other things like the fevers, the coughs, really just not acting like ourselves, that's when we want to stay home. But how do we balance that with missing out? Sometimes we have a really exciting play date planned, or we have a really exciting soccer game that we don't want to miss, or we're in the school play and we're going to miss the rehearsal for the play next week. How do we talk to our kids about that? Because that can be really hard. And so having some of those conversations with our kids about your body is magic. And I use that in my office all the time because I think it's important. Our bodies are pretty amazing at the things that they're able to do. Your body is working so hard to fix you right up and make you feel better. But we have to help our bodies. And so encouraging them to be part of that conversation, encouraging them that they are doing an amazing job by resting their body. Having those kind of uplifting conversations, I think, can really help. The other thing is, I always say get creative. And I will tell you, my families are amazing and they just have some of the most creative ideas. And so some of the things that I think I love to suggest are, let's say we talked about a soccer game. Let's say we're missing out on a soccer game. Well, soccer game, right? That's an hour of activity with a lot of other kids. So it's kind of twofold. We're giving our body a lot to do and we're exposing other people. So maybe instead we have a really special family soccer penalty kick out in the backyard, and it's maybe 10-15 minutes and we are going to have this competition. It's going to be awesome. And all of a sudden we have this great new memory that your kiddo is going to have forever, that, well, when I was 6 years old, I got to have a penalty kick out against dad and I won. And that's what they're going to remember. They're not going to remember missing the soccer game. Also, we gave our body a little bit of energy boost. We got to have that 10 to 15 minutes of good playtime, maybe in our kind of best hours of the day. We also didn't overexert ourselves. So what a great option. And then on the other side of the spectrum, right, we have things like I had a really fun play date planned. We were going to color pictures of Peppa Pig. I was so excited, and now we're not doing that. So now maybe me and mom got to color Peppa Pig a special outfit today, and we're going to take that and we're going to frame it in our room because that is how cool our day is. So coming up with these creative ideas, it doesn't have to be anything super special. We don't want you spending more energy doing a ton of things, but creative things that you already have at home, those are gonna really help your kiddo keep their morale boosted and honestly keep our morale boosted, right? It's a lot more fun when we're thinking about those little things that kind of add to our day as we're getting into the cold and flu season. It really helps keep our morale up. So hopefully a balance between kind of spreading those germs and still getting out to do our day-to-day activities. And when we can't, really coming up with creative, good ways to keep ourselves entertained at home and making special little memories that make the season a little bit brighter. So let's talk a little bit kind of to end things up with flu shots. Who can get the flu shot? Everyone 6 months and up can get the flu shot, which is really great. And we recommend that all of those people do get that. The thing about the flu shot, and this is something that we want to talk about, is it takes 2 weeks to work. So the sooner we get them, the more effective we are for the rest of the season. And what I a lot of times hear is that got the flu shot, but then I got the flu a couple days later. So the flu shot gave me the flu. And this is important. Flu shot takes 2 weeks to work, like we just said. And so it does take that time for us to kind of develop the immunity. So if in that 2 week period, we accidentally got exposed to the flu and caught symptoms, that's why we got the flu. The other thing about the flu shot is you're right, it doesn't work perfectly. Sometimes you get the flu shot and then a few months later you do get the flu. And the good thing about the flu shot is the goal isn't just to prevent it, it's to prevent that severe illness we were talking about. So our goal is that we're keeping us out of the hospital, we're keeping us home, we're able to manage this at home. Some of our higher risk kiddos, so think people of chronic lung disease or asthma, they're at increased risk if they get the flu. They can get a lot sicker than other kids. So it's important that they get some protection. And then we talked about people who are 6 months and up being eligible for the flu shot. So any families that have little infants at home who are less than 6 months going into the season, getting the flu shot for everyone else in the family helps protect the baby. So that's the other reason. Or if you have close friends who you see a lot, who they have a 3-month-old, that baby needs that extra protection. So we're kind of doing a service by them. So we highly recommend call your pediatrician, go to the local pharmacy, get your flu shot for the season. Again, another layer of that protection that we have. I think that's kind of overall, hopefully wraps it up, gives you guys a little bit of information about how to prevent things, what to expect, and how to brace ourselves and hopefully support our kiddos as well as we can.
Doctor, thank you so much. We have several questions, a few that you've actually covered, but I think it would be probably great for us to have you just cover some of these questions again. But one is this one great question is really that, you know, we have at our fingertips the opportunity to go to these urgent cares out there and other fast, quick, you know, tell me what's going on. And this question from this parent is, what is the trigger between calling the office versus just scheduling an appointment and going in? And when do you go to urgent care? How do kids who aren't expressive tell you that they're actually sick?
These are such great questions. So let's start with the first part, which is when do you go to the office and make an appointment versus when do you kind of call the office first? And the answer is it kind of depends on your relationship with your pediatrician. So for us, let's say you call or you kind of just schedule online, you make an appointment and say, my kid's got a cough and cold. One of our nurses is probably going to reach out and ask you a couple questions. And the reason is we want to make sure your kid's not so sick that they need to be seen more urgently than when your appointment's scheduled. That's really the number one reason. So you're never wrong if you're kind of at that point where you're like, it's way easier for me to log online and just schedule this appointment. Versus if you're not sure if your kid really needs to come in, you're like, it's been a couple days, we might be okay. I don't really know if I should bring them in. Call the office because we're going to help guide you whether or not you need to come in. In terms of going to urgent care is being seen more kind of quickly. So some of the things that I would say is most pediatricians' offices tend to have at least a couple late hours or Saturday hours. So I usually say if you can't see your pediatrician, I think that's awesome just because they know you, the office knows you, they're familiar with your care, and they can kind of keep that follow-up. So let's say we sort of think things are okay today, but 2 days from now, you're noticing things are getting worse. You can now call your same pediatrician and they can follow up and know the story already versus urgent care. That's the harder part. That being said, sometimes, it's 8 o'clock and your kiddo looked okay all day, but now we're noticing some of those things we talked about earlier. We're getting later in the day and they really have only had that second wet diaper, or you start noticing some trouble breathing that they didn't have earlier in the day. We don't want to necessarily wait until the next day to see them for that. And so that's a really good time to go into urgent care. Most doctors' offices, including ours at Nemours, have a 24/7 call line. And so if you're ever not sure, you can always call Kids Health on Call and they will say, hey, we're listening to what you're telling us. We think you need to go to urgent care right now instead of waiting to tomorrow. Or they may say, you know what? Why don't you watch them tonight? They look okay. They sound okay. Nothing changes. We're going to schedule you for 8 a.m. first appointment in the morning at one of our offices. So always feel free to call us. And then the other part of your question, I think was so great too. How do some of our kids who aren't as expressive, how do we tell if they're sick? Well, the number one answer is you know your kid best. And I said this earlier because I think it's really true, is you might not notice like all the big things that we talked about with them sneezing or coughing or congested. But you may notice that you made their favorite food for dinner and all of a sudden they're kind of just barely picking at it. Or maybe you offered them a popsicle in pink and that is they will never say no. And they didn't even want it. They shook their head at you. Maybe they don't want to play with their favorite toys that you offer to play with. Those are the signs and symptoms that you know. I don't know what's wrong, but something's wrong. And that's a good time to bring them in too. If you were like, I don't know what's going on, but I know that this is not my kid. That's a perfect time for me to see them and let me see if I can take a listen or a look and find something that's going on. Or say, hey, you're right, this isn't your kiddo, but thankfully everything looks okay right now, and come up with a plan that we can make together.
You just answered the next question. That was when, if my child is faking to skip school, or when to take it seriously. So I love the fact of, if they're eating regularly, or if they like their favorite, whatever, that's when it could be a fake job versus no, they're definitely under the weather. If they're not eating this, that's a sure sign.
Absolutely, exactly. And it is hard. Sometimes we're like, I don't know, are you just showing early signs, or is this kind of you really aren't feeling good? And so those are exactly the things to watch for. And like I said, if you're ever not sure, bring them in, say, okay, we're going to go to the doctor if you're not feeling well. And sometimes that's enough to kind of get them boosted and ready for school too.
Yeah. Yeah. So another good question came in from a parent that said, how can I boost my child's immune system naturally through diet, sleep, or any type of supplements that you'd recommend?
Yeah, so I know we touched on this as well. I think this is a great question. Natural immunity, so vitamin C rich foods. We think about citrus fruits, kiwi. I know it sounds silly, but Brussels sprouts and spinach have a lot of vitamin C in them. And then vitamin D is really great too. So our yogurts, cheeses, milk, these are really great ways to boost our immunity. With kiddos, we don't typically recommend supplements. We really recommend those natural kind of sources, like we just talked about, a lot of those fruits and veggies, other foods too, anything that you're making that feels really good. So those chicken noodle soups, they have a lot of extra protein in them, which is really great too, and a lot of extra hydration. So those are all good sources. But the supplements don't really add a whole lot for us. So we say, let your child's body do its magical work and absorb it from all those natural ingredients. In terms of other ways, we talked about, you asked about sleep. That is such a good question. Good sleep cycles actually have been shown to have decreased, not necessarily how often we get sick, but how long our sickness lasts and how bad our sickness gets. So if we've already been on a good sleep cycle, our body's able to rest and heal easier, which makes us a little bit stronger going into the cold and flu season. So especially this time of year, I think a lot of our sleep schedules are starting to get back on track, but a lot of kids in the summer that transition into school, it's tough. Our sleep cycles are a little bit off. We're not back onto our normal routine. So starting to make sure that we're getting into those practices, really practicing a good bedtime routine so that we can get restful sleep, giving us stronger protection going into the rest of the season.
Thank you. Another question from a parent is, what are the key symptoms I should watch out for to indicate a more serious infection like pneumonia or bronchitis?
Yeah. So in kiddos, definitely pneumonia is something we think about a little bit more. It's a little harder for our kids to get bronchitis, unlike adults, just because of the way that their lungs are. So when we think about more severe illness, a couple of things that we're watching for. One, is your child able to kind of pretty normally, they're getting through the day, they're acting like themselves, that's a good sign. Coughing can sound really horrible even with just a regular virus, but if that cough is lasting, and sometimes it sounds horrible, but kids can cough so much that they're starting to vomit after, sometimes those are signs that we should take a quick listen to their lungs and make sure things look okay. We talked earlier about fevers kind of lasting a little bit longer than we expect. So if your kiddo's getting into the 4th or 5th day of true fevers, 100.4 or higher, and those coughs are just getting worse and worse, bring them in because I want to listen to their lungs and make sure there's no signs of pneumonia as well. And then what about when those viruses seem like we're getting better and that cough won't go away? That's the other thing we think about a lot, right? Or 2 weeks out from your cold and we're still coughing. Bring them in, let's take a listen, because this can be two things. It can be pneumonia, but it can also be what we call post-viral cough syndrome. It's my least favorite thing because it's just this cough that drags. But I'm gonna wanna listen to their lungs and make sure there's no pneumonia if we're kind of hitting 2-3 weeks of coughing without any improvement. Those are the big things. The other side of things is for our kiddos who are a little bit younger, and we can watch kind of in their belly and in their ribs. You may notice, or think about our 1-year-olds or our little babies, you see them breathing and you're watching their ribs, you're watching their belly, and they're always kind of breathing like this. Wow, it's pretty impressive breathing. But if that breathing starts looking more intense, where you see all their rib lines, or you see all those bellies going really far in, really far out, or they're breathing really fast, even for our older kids, those are things that we want to be seen for more emergently. So when we talked about when to go to urgent care, when to call to make sure we can be seen right away, those are the things that we're talking about, even going to the ER. Those are the things that I worry about, okay? And then same thing for our kiddos who have things like asthma. If they're needing that albuterol and you're not seeing them get any relief, you're noticing that they're really not wanting to talk very much, you're going straight to the ER, you're calling for help, okay? Because those are things that we do not want to mess around with.
So we've got 3 questions pretty much similar to each of them, which is, can you give us a little bit more of your thoughts and wisdom on elderberry, echinacea, probiotics, and zinc? That we, should we use these types of supplements to mitigate, our child's chances of getting a cold or flu during the season?
Good question. So we said elderberry, echinacea, probiotics, and then zinc was the last one, right?
Yep.
Okay, so I'm gonna split probiotics into a little bit of a separate category because when I think about probiotics, I'm thinking a little bit more about your gut health than our protection from cold and flu season. So kiddos who are on antibiotics, maybe they got an ear infection, maybe they got strep throat, maybe they got a pneumonia, things like that, and we know that their antibiotics, they're so great for the things that they're used for. It's why we're so careful when we use them, but they can make your gut a little bit upset. I think that's a great time for a probiotic. And the way I usually recommend it is instead of just doing like a supplement probiotic, there's a lot of yogurts that have probiotics in them. I think that's awesome. I think that's great. They don't necessarily make a huge difference in terms of cold and flu season, but I think they're safe to use. And again, my preference is those yogurts that have probiotics in them. I think that's safer for kids. It's usually better tolerated. They don't mind the taste, so it's kind of a win-win-win. In terms of elderberry, so, funny enough, this is a really good question because I think about it a lot myself as well. And I don't think that there's anything unsafe, thankfully, with using elderberry. They're still doing a lot of studies in kids because, right, we don't want kids at risk, so we have to be really careful in how we're studying them. And there's not a ton of data that tells us yes, no, maybe so. It's kind of half and half. We're not really sure if it's super helpful, but I don't think there's any harm in elderberry. Again, I do say with a grain of salt, any of these supplements, I don't really want to be using in a kid less than 1 year old. And that's just because, again, they're much more at risk for a lot of things. And we just don't have all the evidence and the data to tell us that it's safe. And then with zinc and echinacea, there have been a lot more studies in those two, just they've been around a little bit longer, they've been popular a little bit longer. And there's not really a whole ton to say that they're super effective in preventing colds and flus. So what I say is sort of, again, when we think about this is there's lots of foods that have some of these things in them. Picking those foods that are a little bit richer in those ingredients may be really helpful, rather than kind of choosing to pick a supplement up over the counter that hasn't really been studied in kids and isn't really as regulated. We worry, right? We don't know what else is in them. We don't know if there's something else in them. So when we think about zinc rich foods, things like eggs, lentils, these are great options. Those are things that a lot of kids like. You're still getting the kind of benefits, and we don't have to take the risks of what else could be in those supplements.
Great. Wow, this is a great question that I even have from this one parent, and that is, we live in a world where everybody wants to be clean, and one of the best practices for teaching my child good hygiene to avoid catching or spreading viruses when at times could they be too clean and they need to actually eat, dirt? Like what?
No,
It's
that's such a good question. Absolutely. Like, how do we balance that? How do we get them the immunity that they need? So the reality is,
you do like, do you let the 3 second rule? It's okay to go to 10 seconds? Is it okay? I mean, it's a great question. I mean, as a parent too, I'm thinking, wow, that's one that, how clean do you have to be, and how do you stop the spread, or what's good hygiene?
yeah, this is so good. And again, it's some of it is kind of like, look at the draw case by case. We might be kind of adjusting based on the situation. There's not a perfect answer. Can you be too clean? No, you can't. Your kid's going to still get that immunity that they need over time. Doesn't always feel great to see them get sick again and again, but it's just your body's way of learning those immunities. It's why sometimes, right, your kid gets sick, sometimes you're sick, sometimes you get lucky and you're not as sick or you don't get sick at all. And that's because you've already got that immunity. You got that immunity a few years ago. It's also why, your 6-month-old is sick every time your 3-year-old's sick, except your 6-month-old sometimes is sick and your 3-year-old isn't, because they've gotten that immunity. So they're going to get it one way or another, whether that's when they go to daycare for the first time, school for the first time, or around more kids in the winter, all different ways. How do we teach our child those hygiene measures? Let's make hand washing fun. Find a fun song that they love. That's what we get to listen to every time we wash our hands to get in the practice of it. Let them be part of the experience. I know it sounds silly. Pick a fun soap dispenser. I have a couple kiddos that love it because they get to use they got they're very into Frozen. They got Frozen soap dispensers for their room. So they're super excited. They make soaps that have like all kinds of colors, just anything to make it fun. Get them into the habit of excitement around hand washing. 3-second rule, 10-second rule. When can we pick up the food and eat it off the ground? Obviously, our rule of thumb is, if it's been there, maybe don't eat it. If we just dropped it and we picked it up really quick, it's probably okay. Maybe not the best thing. Is it going to cause your child harm? Probably not. But sometimes I do have kids that, they saw something on the playground. We did not drop it. Someone else has dropped it there. Those are the things we definitely want to say, no, please don't eat that one. But the number one thing we can do is teach them to make hand washing fun, let them practice, and just know, no matter how you do it, they're going to be okay, because their body is so strong and so amazing, and it's going to help protect them, even if it feels a little bit bad while we're having to learn that protection.
Doctor, this has been incredible. As a parent, I've learned so much. I know all of our parents have tonight. I really enjoyed your wisdom and your expertise. For more information, you can go to nemours.org or kidshealth.org. That is probably one of the greatest places to go for tips, best practices, recommendations. All the great people at Nemours have made this website incredible for us parents. Also, if you have any specific questions for Nemours or from tonight's broadcast, feel free to email us at admissions@esfcamps.com. We'd be happy to follow up with you with any specific questions you might have with Dr. Pubi, and as well as anybody at Nemours. So again, thank you so much for your time, Doctor. Thank you for all the families that are on tonight for joining us. And I think we're in for a cold and flu season, but we're well prepared thanks to you, Doctor. So thanks again. Appreciate it. And thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you guys so much for having me. I hope everyone stays healthy and safe. Have a great rest of your night.
Great night. Thank you, everybody. Take care.